We shall begin by attempting to date the Gospel of Matthew, since, per my earlier discussion of the Synoptic problem, I take it that Matthew was the first of the Gospels to have been written. Mainstream scholarship typically dates the Gospel of Matthew to sometime around 85 AD, with the rationale being that Matthew depends on Mark, and that Mark was written around 70 AD. As Larry Chouinard explains, the majority view is that Matthew was written after Mark, sometime between the dates of AD 70 and 100. However, the arguments adduced to establish such a dating scheme are largely based upon prior judgments concerning the order of gospel composition or hypothetical reconstructions of developments in the first century. Pivotal to the post-70 dating of Matthew is the contention that Matthew knew and used Mark as a major source for the writing of his gospel. Since the consensus of scholarly judgment dates Mark in the 60s, it is therefore likely that Matthew composed his gospel sometime after AD 70. Of course, if one rejects Markan priority, or the suggested date for Markan composition, the argument fails to be convincing. If, as I argued before, the case for Markan priority is not airtight, then the possibility of a much earlier date for Matthew's Gospel presents itself. As we saw, the Patristics are unanimous in affirming that Matthew was authored prior to the other Gospels. However, the Patristics also appear to tell us something else about Matthew, namely that it was written in Hebrew. But the difficulty is that the Gospel of Matthew that we know today is written in Greek, not Hebrew. So if the Patristics are telling us that the Gospel of Matthew that preceded the Gospels of Mark and Luke was written in Hebrew, then perhaps this indicates that our canonical Gospel of Matthew should not automatically be assumed to have been written prior to Mark and Luke. Perhaps it was actually this Hebrew Matthew that was written before Mark and Luke. This whole concern is motivated entirely by the assumption that the Patristics do, in fact, claim that Matthew's Gospel was written in Hebrew in the first place. I do not question the fact that later church fathers, like Origen, Jerome, and St. Augustine, thought that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. However, these church fathers are much farther removed from the writing of the Gospels and may be misunderstanding the statements of earlier church fathers. The only two early sources that might be thought to be asserting that Matthew was originally authored in Hebrew are Papias and Irenaeus. Strikingly, they are also the most vague in their wording. The word translated as language in Papias and Irenaeus is the Greek word dialecto, and it can also be legitimately translated as style or dialect. On this interpretation, Papias and Irenaeus would be saying that Matthew wrote for a Hellenistic Jewish audience. As Larry Chouinard points out, while much critical opinion has assumed that Papias' errant view of an original Semitic Matthew discounts his testimony about Matthew being the author, in recent times, the evidence afforded by the testimony of Papias has been reassessed. On the one hand, some scholars have argued that the terms Ibredi dialecto do not refer to the Hebrew or Aramaic language, but rather to a Jewish style or literary form. In this view, Papias would be referring to Matthew's penchant for Semitic themes and devices, not an original Semitic gospel. And Bernard Orchard adds, in the first century, dialecto commonly meant both language and style, so that our phrase could mean either in a Jewish language or in a Jewish style, depending on the context. It must be said that this suggestion looks extremely plausible when one reads the canonical Gospel of Matthew. After all, despite being written in Greek, it reflects the most distinctively Jewish outlook and concerns of any of the four Gospels. As R.T. France points out, Matthew is a Gospel which devotes more space than the others to quotation of and meditation on the Old Testament, which is saturated with Old Testament language, which presents fuller accounts of Jesus' debates with the scribal and other Jewish authorities, and focuses more on questions of Jewish legal observance and rabbinic discussion. And William Varner adds, Matthew's account presents to us a Jewish Jesus who lived and worked in a thoroughly Jewish world. Matthew's gospel thus bears witness to a very Jewish Jesus whose life and ministry were formed and nurtured by his own people's history and heritage. So this interpretation of Papias and Irenaeus matches what we find in the canonical Gospel of Matthew extremely well. Given that the word dialecto can mean either Hebrew language or Hebrew style, we must look to the context of Papias and Irenaeus to determine which translation is more appropriate. Speaking of context, it is rather plausible that the context of Papias, at least, favors this alternative translation, for Papias' elder surely seems to be fussing over the style of the Gospels by saying that Mark was not written in an orderly fashion, whereas Matthew gave the proper order. As Robert Gundry argues, in his statement quoted by Papias, the elder shows concern over Mark's style, particularly over the disorderly way the single points concerning Jesus' ministry appear in the Gospel of Mark. This concern favors a similar frame of reference in the statement about Matthew, whose writing, by contrast, exhibits orderliness. This contrast comes out clearly in the elder's parallelistic use of the verb arranged to describe what Matthew did do with the Lord's oracles, and of the cognate noun arrangement to describe what Mark, following Peter, did not do with the Lord's oracles. Furthermore, the elder says nothing at all about the linguistic form of Mark, which he ought to mention if it is his intention to introduce, by way of contrast, a different linguistic form in Matthew. Apparently, Matthew does not have a linguistic form different from Mark's Greek. A Hebrew dialect, then, does not imply that Matthew wrote in the Aramaic language. Furthermore, it should be noted that Papias does not include a definite article prior to his reference to a Hebrew dialecto, which he ought to include if it is his intent to say that Matthew was written in the Hebrew tongue. While most English translations of Papias supply the definite article, this is an interpretive translation. The Greek itself provides no support for this translation, and the considerations that we have been exploring point in the opposite direction. Now, some scholars have argued that the context of Papias better fits the translation of dialecto as language due to Papias' subsequent remarks, saying that everyone translated Matthew's gospel as best they could. For example, Jedidiah Tritle remarks, "It is thus plausible that Papias believed that Matthew wrote in the Hebrew language, given that others had to translate it as they were able." But this argument is predicated upon translated being the best interpretation of Papias' use of the Greek word hermeneusin. But much like the word dialecto itself, hermeneusin is a vague term that could just as easily be translated as saying interpreted. On this reading, Papias would be saying that everyone interpreted Matthew as best they could, rather than saying that everyone translated it as best they could. In fact, in the other instance where we know that Papias used a cognate of this term, namely in his reference to Mark as Peter's interpreter, it almost certainly is intended to be understood as an interpretation rather than as a translation. David Sim makes a similar argument against Gundry's preferred translation of Papias, saying, "While Gundry's understanding of Papias' language here falls within the category of possibility, it is not very plausible. His discussion of dialecto and hermeneusin, in isolation from one another, tends to obscure their more natural meaning when they are found together. Thus, the association suggests translation of a Semitic original into Greek. This remains true despite Papias giving the nominal cognate slightly differently nuanced elsewhere in the passage. Such a rendering also makes best sense of the statement that different Christians handled this text as each was able. Papias was making the point that those who translated this Semitic document into Greek did so to the best of their bilingual abilities. Gundry's alternative interpretation, that these people exposited or interpreted the gospel as best they could, is far less satisfactory. Why would the Evangelist's Jewish portrayal of Jesus present such difficulties that its later expositors could only explain it as each was able? Sim's objection is more clever than Tritle's, for whereas Tritle had to assume a dubious reading of hermeneusin as translated, even though the term is known to refer to interpretation rather than translation elsewhere in Papias, Sim argues that the conjunction of dialecto and hermeneusin together supports translating these terms as language and translated, respectively. While Sim is right to remind us of how these terms are typically used together in literature of the time, and while this is undoubtedly the strongest point that he makes against Gundry, he neglects a very basic principle of interpretation, namely that context determines meaning. While it is valuable to consider how terms are commonly used together in other literature, fundamentally, the author's own uses of terms and the immediate context carry the most weight. And as I've already shown, both the context of Papias as well as his usage of these terms elsewhere support Gundry's reading over Sim's. Sim frankly never deals with the fact that the context much more strongly supports Gundry's translation than his own. As Gundry concludes, in other connections, we should expect the conjunction of Hebrew and dialect to form a linguistic reference, but the stylistic contrast between Mark and Matthew cancels such an expectation here, and the lack of a definite article in ibridi dialecto facilitates, though it does not prove, a different reference, since dialecto always has the definite article in its 6 occurrences for language in Acts, including 3 for the Hebrew or Aramaic language. As for Sim's other argument, that his preferred translation makes better sense of Papias' subsequent remarks, saying that everyone interpreted Matthew's writing as best they could, I must confess that the opposite conclusion strikes me as more plausible. Indeed, Sim's interpretation begins to look rather silly if we take seriously Papias' statement that everyone did this. While I don't think that Papias literally means everyone, he presumably is referring to quite a lot of people within the Christian community. But are we seriously to believe that a substantial number of Christians were personally translating Matthew? Why not just have one person do it for the whole community? It makes far better sense to think that Matthew was originally written in Greek, but for Hellenistic Jews, which created certain interpretive difficulties for non-Jewish readers of his gospel, resulting in a substantial number of Christians interpreting his gospel as best they could. And clearly, this accords better with Gundry's preferred translation of Papias as saying that Matthew wrote in a Hebrew style or dialect, rather than in the Hebrew language. Sim sort of anticipates this move, but he has this to say in response. The Gospel of Matthew was the most favored gospel in the ancient church, and nobody considered it to be an especially difficult text. Sim is quite right that the Gospel of Matthew was indeed the favorite gospel of the early church. However, his remarks about no one considering it a particularly difficult text to understand are misplaced. In the first place, Papias is describing the initial composition and reception of Matthew's gospel. So even if Christians in the later 1st and 2nd century didn't struggle to interpret Matthew, Papias may simply be referring to the difficulties faced by the earliest non-Jewish recipients of Matthew's Gospel. But secondly, Sim's indication that no early Christians struggled to understand Matthew is simply not true. For example, in Against Heresies 3:11-8, Irenaeus notes significant controversy over how to make sense of Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. Similarly, Origen, in his commentary on Matthew, especially 10:1-2 and 10:22, frequently notes that Christians have a variety of interpretations of various passages within Matthew. So contrary to Sim's suggestion, we do in fact have some concrete data indicating that early Christians struggled to interpret Matthew. So much for a Hebrew Matthew in Papias. What about our next earliest source, Irenaeus? Well, as with Papias, Irenaeus also uses the Greek term dialecto, and so has the same vagueness inherent to his statement as was present in Papias' statement. So Irenaeus could also be read as saying that Matthew wrote in a Hebrew style or dialect just as easily as Papias. Unfortunately, however, Irenaeus does not offer the same contextual grounds as Papias does for concluding that he is referring to a Hebrew style rather than the Hebrew language. And whereas Papias does not include any definite article, which argues strongly against his referring to the Hebrew language, Irenaeus does include a definite article. Thus, while I still regard it as likely that Irenaeus is merely saying that Matthew was written in a Hebrew style, for those who are skeptical, allow me to offer another way to read Irenaeus without thereby concluding that he is saying that Matthew is written in the Hebrew language. It is possible to understand Irenaeus as saying that Matthew was written with reference to the Hebrews' own language rather than in their own language, if Irenaeus is understood to be using the dative of reference rather than the dative of sphere. Daniel Moore proposes such a translation, saying, BDF characterizes the dative of respect as being appropriate when contrast is involved either in the text or in the mind. Indeed, this appears to be the problem which has plagued translators and scholars throughout the centuries in handling Irenaeus. The reference-respect approach to the dative fits well in this passage if we understand the passage to be asserting that Matthew published among the Hebrews that which was in reference to their own language, but not their own language. Accordingly, since Irenaeus is communicating the backstory of the Gospels, my preferred translation is, Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in a language contrasting with their own. Thus Matthew published in Greek, a language which was not the native language of the Hebrews. Lastly, it is also worth pointing out that we have no manuscripts of this Hebrew Gospel of Matthew that is supposed to have existed. Of course, it is quite fair to point out here that the vast majority of ancient literature has not survived until the present day. But we know that the early Christians were extraordinarily good at preserving written Gospels. Our canonical Gospels, along with the rest of the New Testament, represent the best preserved works from antiquity. Are we really to believe that the early Christians, who took such pains to preserve the other Gospels for us, somehow completely lost this work, authored by the Apostle Matthew himself, such that no textual trace of it has survived? That surely seems a stretch. As Carson, Moo, and Morris say, it is not at all clear how an apostolic source as important as this could have fallen so completely out of use as to be lost to posterity. And William Varner adds, while it is possible that Papias was referring to a Gospel of Matthew written in the Hebrew language, it is hard to understand why no ancient copy of Matthew in Hebrew survives. A better approach to Papias is to recognize that the word dialect can also refer to the Hebrew style, in which Matthew recorded and presented the words of Jesus. This Jewish style is evident in his gospel. But what then are we to do with later statements from church fathers like Origen and St. Augustine claiming that there was a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew? Why does Jerome think that it existed in his own day in the library of Caesarea? And why does Pantaenus think that he saw a copy among the Ebionites of India? Statements about the existence of this document abound. As James Edwards remarks, the widespread and enduring testimony in early Christianity to a Hebrew gospel is the single most important conclusion of the first two chapters. The evidence is more considerable than even specialists in the field often imagine. The tradition of an original gospel written in Hebrew is attested by 20 church fathers. As my earlier discussion has indicated, I am in the habit of taking the testimony of the Patristic seriously. However, I put the count a bit lower than Edwards, since I think the two earliest sources he includes, Papias and Irenaeus, are not saying that Matthew was written in Hebrew at all. And I think that, perhaps, this gives us some indication of how a legend may have developed. My suspicion is that these later church fathers badly misread Papias and or Irenaeus, and assumed, as many today still do, that they were saying that Matthew was written in the Hebrew language. Regarding Jerome, I suspect that what he saw and copied was the now lost Gospel to the Hebrews, which, based on his misunderstanding of Papias and Irenaeus, he assumed was Hebrew Matthew. As Donald Hagner suggests, that there was at least one, perhaps more than one, gospel in Aramaic or Hebrew known to the early church may have added to the confusion caused by Papias' statement, wrongly tempting the early church fathers to think of the Gospel of Matthew. Notably, the translations that Jerome claims come from this Hebrew Matthew bear no resemblance to the canonical Gospel of Matthew, and his own Latin Vulgate is clearly translating from the Greek Matthew that we possess today, rather than whatever Hebrew Gospel Jerome possessed. As R.T. France summarizes, Jerome frequently refers to a Gospel according to the Hebrews, which he claims to have translated himself into both Greek and Latin. He associates it with the Nazarenes, and it was the Nazarenes who he claims gave him permission to copy the Hebrew original of the Gospel of Matthew. Yet the passages he quotes from the Gospel according to the Hebrews are clearly not from the canonical Matthew. Here, then, there is good reason to suspect a confusion between the assumed original Hebrew Matthew and a separate but related Gospel according to the Hebrews, which was in fact preserved in Hebrew or Aramaic. The situation is unclear in several ways, but there is enough common ground among the various patristic references to indicate the existence of at least one Semitic gospel in use among Jewish Christian groups, Ebionites and Nazarenes, which they associated with the name of Matthew, but which was in fact different from the canonical Gospel of Matthew. In that case, it is at least possible that the tradition that the canonical Matthew was written in a Semitic language arose from a confusion such as we see in the case of Jerome. Whatever the reason, it seems that the widespread tradition of the original language of Matthew was wrong. Pantaenus' reference to a Hebrew Matthew among the Ebionites of India might similarly be explained by him confusing the Gospel to the Hebrews for a Hebrew Matthew that he mistakenly believed to exist based on his own misreading of Papias and Irenaeus. Pantaenus himself was Sicilian, and it is doubtful that he was even able to read Hebrew or Aramaic. This is perhaps why he describes this gospel as being written in Hebrew letters, potentially betraying the fact that he himself could not read the document, but could only recognize the type of lettering. Pantaenus' account is further hampered by the fact that he reports the Ebionites as claiming that Bartholomew left them this Hebrew gospel, even though Thomas is the apostle who is more strongly associated with India. The likelihood of a language barrier between Pantaenus and the Ebionites renders plausible Orpah Slack's suggestion in The Jews of India that Pantaenus misunderstood the Ebionites and thought that they had claimed that Bartholomew gave them this gospel when, in reality, it was the Apostle Thomas. This is somewhat plausible when one considers that church tradition generally places Thomas rather than Bartholomew in India, and that the Aramaic term for St. Thomas, Mar Thoma, sounds somewhat similar to the Hebrew name for Bartholomew, Bar Ptolemy. If Pantaenus could not even understand the language of the Ebionites, then it is virtually certain that he could not read whatever gospel they had. This means that he could not verify that it was a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. It might have been any Hebrew document. In short, there is just too much margin for error regarding Pantaenus' claim to have seen a Hebrew Matthew for us to have any confidence in his testimony. Furthermore, what other church fathers tell us about this Hebrew Ebionite gospel tends to confirm that it was nothing like canonical Matthew. Epiphanius tells us that it does not contain a genealogy of Jesus and contains other heretical material. This is corroborated by Irenaeus, who tells us that the Ebionites used only the Gospel of Matthew, but also that they denied the virgin birth. Presumably, this indicates that whatever gospel they had did not include the nativity story, further distinguishing it from the Gospel of Matthew that we know today. Carson, Moo, and Morris rightly conclude, all this suggests that there was ample opportunity for confusion to arise between some Gospel according to the Hebrews and Matthew, engendering the theory that the latter was originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic. So to conclude, I do not think that we need to assume the existence of a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. Our two earliest sources are best interpreted as saying that Matthew wrote in Greek for Hellenistic Jews. The later sources, attesting to the existence of this work, can easily be seen as misreading the earlier sources and confusing what they describe with the Gospel to the Hebrews. And this accounts for the total absence of this Hebrew Gospel of Matthew from the manuscript tradition. Consequently, I will be proceeding on the assumption that there never was a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, and, therefore, that when our early sources claim that Matthew was the first Gospel to have been written, they are indeed placing the canonical Gospel of Matthew first in the timeline. There is a further concern about Papias' testimony and whether it refers to the canonical Gospel of Matthew, which is distinct from the issue of the language in which Matthew is supposed to have been written. This arises from Papias' use of the term logia, or sayings, in reference to Matthew, which some have thought indicates that the text to which Papias refers is a sayings gospel, much like the Gospel of Thomas. This would mean that the Gospel of Matthew that Papias knew contained no narrative, and this would distinguish it from canonical Matthew. Now, I have dealt with this objection to identifying Papias' Gospel of Matthew with our canonical Gospel of Matthew in detail in my video on gospel authorship, so I won't belabor the point here, but allow me to briefly summarize the problems with this objection. The major problem is that the idea that logia can only refer to sayings is certainly wrong, for Papias likewise uses the term in reference to Mark's Gospel in the very same passage. There, he is very careful to specify that logia includes both the sayings and the actions of Jesus, meaning that Papias does not use this term to exclusively refer to sayings. The other problem for this objection is that other early Christians, like Irenaeus and Origen, also use this term to refer to the Gospels, suggesting that the term logia was simply an early Christian synonym for gospel. There is also a long laundry list of more general objections to the historical reliability of Papias, ranging from Eusebius calling him a man of low intelligence, to his supposedly getting the details of Judas's death wrong. This is not the place to get sidetracked by offering a full-scale defense of the reliability of Papias, though I have done that in my video on gospel authorship. Much more can be said here, but for the remainder of this video, I will be taking it to be established that Papias was indeed referring to our canonical Gospel of Matthew. To summarize this section, we have seen that the earliest sources, typically taken to attest to the existence of a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, are better interpreted as saying that Matthew wrote in Greek, but for a Jewish audience. The later sources, testifying to the existence of a Hebrew Matthew, appear to be greatly confused, and it is noteworthy that there is no manuscript evidence for a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. The conclusion is that there is no good reason to think that the earliest church fathers are not talking about our canonical Gospel of Matthew when they place it first in the timeline. Regrettably, there is one further obstacle to the patristic case for Matthean priority that we must now address. Many scholars, including R H Gundry, whom I cited approvingly in the previous section, believe that Papias actually claims that Mark was written prior to Matthew. As he says, when recognized as referring back to the statement about Mark, un contains an immensely important implication for synoptic studies. The word normally carries the inferential meaning, therefore. So the elder, i.e., the Apostle John, is saying that Matthew wrote his gospel for the precise purpose of bringing order out of the chaos in Mark. Thus we have astonishingly early external evidence that Mark wrote first and that Matthew knew Mark's gospel and wrote his own in view of it. Similarly, Francis Watson writes, so, un suggests that Matthew wrote after Mark and in response to the perceived deficiency in Mark. As the verb indicates, Matthew did what Mark and Peter did not do. Mark was defective through no fault of his own. Matthew wrote his gospel to make good his predecessor's deficiency. Papias and his elder consider Matthew's gospel superior to Mark's. They also presuppose Markan priority. But contrary to what Gundry and Watson indicate, this observation is far from decisive. The inference hinges entirely upon the idea that something like so, or therefore, is the best translation of the word un, which is already not certain. As Ward Powers points out, Gundry's argument, however, depends totally on the meaning of un, therefore, in Eusebius 3:39-16. Gundry's interpretation of un is far from obvious and far from certain, yet Gundry hangs his conclusion on this very tenuous thread. Furthermore, this argument assumes that Papias's remarks about the origins of Matthew's gospel follow immediately after his remarks about the origins of Mark's gospel. That is the only way to conclude from this that Papias is tacitly affirming Markan priority. While it is true that Eusebius, our source for both of these statements from Papias, cites the tradition about Mark prior to the tradition about Matthew and in close proximity to one another, they are nevertheless two separate citations from Papias's works. We cannot be confident that the tradition about Matthew is written after the tradition about Mark in Papias's original writings, and even if it were, we certainly could not be confident that it followed immediately after the tradition about Mark. There may have been any number of things discussed in between these two statements. This is a significant vulnerability for the argument that Papias attests to the priority of Mark. As Daniel Moore remarks, although the order of these quotes does not align with their modern canonical order, Eusebius's purpose in including these two disparate quotes does not appear to be for the purpose of establishing a particular publication order. And R.T. France adds, Papias's comments on Matthew and Mark are disappointing, as he does not indicate the date of writing of either gospel, nor do we know from Eusebius's separate presentation of the two statements whether and in what way they were related to each other in their original context. Altogether, Papias forms a flimsy basis for any conclusion on the question of priority. Just going based on what Eusebius records about Papias's traditions concerning the origins of Matthew and Mark in Ecclesiastical History 339:16, I think that Mark Goodacre, a vaunted Markan priorist, offers the most sensible conclusion to draw when he says, in the quotations given to us by the 4th century church historian Eusebius, Papias is quoting his own source, the elder, who apparently mentioned both that Mark is an interpreter of Peter and that Matthew compiled the logia, reports or oracles, but in the extant passages, there is no statement of relative priority. But we can go further. C.E. Hill has published numerous works arguing that Eusebius records a fuller statement of Papias's gospel traditions in Ecclesiastical History 324, 5-13. Here, Eusebius recounts an unnamed record which attests to the priority of Matthew. Hill's literary analysis of this passage finds striking similarities between what this unnamed source records about the origins of the Gospels and what Papias uncontroversially said about the origins of Matthew and Mark. I have developed Hill's case for thinking that what Eusebius records here just is Papias's fourfold gospel tradition in detail in my video on gospel authorship. Suffice it for now to say that both Papias and this unnamed source share common concerns, similar ways of speaking, similar and unusual sentence constructions, and even rare words that are known to be a part of Papias's vocabulary, but are not known to be common to Eusebius's vocabulary. As Hill points out in a detailed article on the subject, 3 times in the short space of 339:15, Papias's account of Mark, there occurs a distinctive feature of the elder's paraphoristic use of poio in the middle voice with an accompanying noun. The same feature turns up here in 324:7, where Eusebius is paraphrasing his source. The elder quoted by Papias in 339:15 also has a distinctive way of speaking about the contents of the Gospels. A great deal of attention has been given to his mention of the Lord's logia, which he says Mark and Matthew contain. This has sometimes obscured the fact that this presbyter also speaks of Mark as recording the things said or done by the Lord, using here the aorist passive participle. The source used by Eusebius in 324 uses the same notation. The passive participle aorist, or perfect, of preso for the deeds of Jesus in the Gospels occurs no less than 4 times in Eusebius's paraphrase and summary of his source. And in another work he concludes, both accounts also stress the respective apostles' work of preaching before they wrote. What is more, after introducing the accounts of both Gospels, Eusebius follows the first excerpt about John with the words, "And the record is surely true." The record here, naturally referring to the preceding one. Eusebius is definitely presenting this account of the origins of Matthew and John as from a single written source, and, though he does not name that source, there is no credible alternative to regarding it as Papias of Hierapolis. These common elements and concerns point to a common source. From a comparison with the other Papian fragments on the Gospels in Eusebius, then, there is fairly conclusive support for regarding Eusebius's source in 324, 5-13, as being Papias' tradition about the fourth gospel. A further point in support of Hill's thesis, though Hill himself does not make it, comes from the anti-Marcionite prologue, where we read that Papias recorded that John wrote the fourth gospel. This would corroborate Hill's thesis that Papias did indeed have traditions about all four gospels. Of course, the anti-Marcionite prologue is not regarded as being especially historically reliable, but even granting that it is not, it still contains a direct reference to the works of Papias, claiming that he spoke about the origins of the Gospel of John. And that would be a very odd thing to fabricate, especially at a time when Papias' writing still existed, and this claim could be fact-checked easily. Monte Shanks reminds us, there is some question regarding the credibility of the author of this fragment when handling historical material. It should be noted, however, that he was not inaccurate with respect to everything he wrote concerning Papias. He correctly noted, for example, that Papias was from Hierapolis, and that he had written a 5-volume work. While certain material contained in this fragment requires critical analysis, this fragment should not be unnecessarily marginalized as having no historical value. Dean Furlong has argued that Hill's identification of Papias as the source for this unnamed tradition in Eusebius is supported by other sources that also demonstrate familiarity with this tradition. He identifies that a 9th century fragment of the martyrdom of Timothy is also familiar with this tradition, but relates it in slightly different terms than Eusebius does. And once again, thematic and verbal parallels with Papias emerge. Similarly, the 5th century Acts of Timothy knows this tradition, but again relates it in terms other than either Eusebius or the martyrdom of Timothy use. And yet, still, similarities to Papias' writing style exist within it. Furlong also suggests that the tradition is plausibly known to the anonymous author of the preface to St. Augustine's Tractates on John, the Menologium of the Greeks, the Armenian History of James and John, Hippolytus, Theophylact, the Suffering of John, and the Acts of John by Prochorus, although the connections to Papias are admittedly thinner here. Furlong's most interesting piece of evidence comes from Theodore of Mopsuestia, who knows this tradition, but for a variety of reasons, is unlikely to be relying upon Eusebius for it. No fewer than 7 unique Greek words are shared between the account that uncontroversially comes from Papias in Ecclesiastical History 339, 14-16, and Theodore of Mopsuestia's account, but are not shared with Eusebius. Not only are the words the same, but they are used to describe and relate the same things in Theodore's account as they are used to describe and relate in Papias's. Furlong concludes by saying, this passage from Theodore of Mopsuestia, which relates, like the unattributed fragment, the narrative of the Gospels being brought to John and being evaluated by him, but which exhibits its own independent points of context with Papian sources, suggestive of an independent Papian derivation. Skeptics will be swift to point out that Hill's thesis has not yet found widespread support among scholars. That much is true, but I would point out that Hill's proposal is fairly recent, having only been proposed less than 3 decades ago. Scholarly opinion rarely shifts significantly overnight, but we are seeing signs that Hill's proposal is starting to make ripples, if not waves, in the world of biblical studies. Dean Furlong, himself no lightweight in the world of biblical studies, has endorsed Hill's thesis and even extended out newer and broader argumentation in support of it. Likewise, T. Scott Manor, another scholar of considerable caliber, has endorsed Hill's thesis, although he adds some modifications of his own. As he says, other scholars have argued that Papias likely did speak of the Gospel of John. Notably, Charles E. Hill has argued that Eusebius's testimony concerning the origins of the Gospel of John may originate with Papias, but Eusebius failed to ascribe it to him. Hill's argument is compelling and, generally speaking, convincing. In fact, in the most up-to-date collection of the fragments of Papias, Stephen Carlson, perhaps the world's leading Papian scholar, includes Ecclesiastical History 324, 5-13 as a potential citation of Papias. Carlson even credits Hill's paper for generating his own interest in Papias in the preface, saying, "It was reading the articles of Charles E. Hill and Richard Bauckham that opened my eyes to the possibility that Papias' influence was potentially much greater than what scholars think. Because these bits of potential Papiana were not collected together in the standard editions, I began collecting the places where traces of Papias could have been found. This book is the fruit of this collection." In fairness, Carlson ultimately doesn't think that this is a genuine fragment of Papias, but the point is just that Hill's thesis is absolutely part of the mainstream conversation surrounding Papias, even if it has not won widespread scholarly support. As such, it cannot simply be written off as fringe or something that only conservative Christians take seriously. Later on, when we discuss the date of composition for Luke and Acts, I will also argue that Papias quotes from Luke's Gospel at one point, meaning that Papias did indeed know all four Gospels, and this substantially strengthens Hill's thesis. If Hill is correct, and I am fully convinced that he is, then this is proof positive that Papias was in full agreement with the other patristics on the priority of Matthew. As far as I am concerned, this is the final nail in the coffin of this frankly desperate and tiresome argument that Papias affirmed Markan priority. We can be confident that he did not. To draw this section to a close, we have seen that even when restricting ourselves to the uncontroversial fragments of Papias, there are no solid grounds for inferring that he believed Mark to have been written prior to Matthew. Furthermore, there are good grounds for believing that Eusebius's gospel tradition, preserved in Ecclesiastical History 324, comes from Papias, and that, therefore, Papias agreed with the other church fathers on the priority of Matthew. Because of these two considerations, it should no longer be claimed that Papias provides some sort of primitive knowledge of Markan priority. So far, we have concluded that Papias was indeed referencing the canonical Gospel of Matthew, and that he placed it first among the Gospels. This information is helpful in dating Matthew, but just how early does Papias allow us to place Matthew in the timeline? Well, to answer that question, we must determine where Papias himself falls in the timeline. Now, mainstream scholarship sometimes tries to date Papias as late as 135 AD, which, although early, would not make his knowledge of Matthew's Gospel early enough to necessarily indicate a first century date. The main argument for dating Papias to 135 AD comes from a statement by the 5th century Christian historian Philip of Side. Philip claims that Papias issued an apologetic to the Roman Emperor Hadrian, wherein he claimed that people who Jesus had raised from the dead were still alive during Hadrian's reign. Now, Hadrian was emperor from 117 AD to 138 AD, so the assumption is that, if Philip is correct, then Papias had to be writing during that time. Of course, there are several problems here. The first is that, even if we were to accept Philip's statement at face value, since Hadrian's reign began in 117 AD, Papias could have been writing closer to 117 than to 138. There's no reason for assuming that Papias had to be writing towards the end of Hadrian's reign. But second, and much more seriously, as we shall see, there are good reasons in Eusebius for dating Papias' writings much earlier. perhaps as early as the end of the 1st century. Eusebius was writing almost 100 years earlier than Philip of Side, after all, and as a general rule, historians prefer earlier testimonies to later ones. Lastly, Philip of Side is an extremely unreliable source, and it is plausible that he is depending on Eusebius for his information about Papias, while, unfortunately, confusing some of Eusebius's statements. As Robert Gundry explains, the only hard evidence in favor of a late date comes in a statement of Philip of Side, who makes Papias refer to the reign of Hadrian, but we have good reasons to distrust Philip's statement. He is notoriously unreliable, and wrote approximately a century later than Eusebius did. Comparison of Philip's statement with Eusebius's favors that Philip depended on Eusebius, but garbled the information he got. Eusebius mentions a Christian writer named Quadratus, who addressed an apology to Hadrian, the very emperor during whose reign Philip puts Papias's writings. The claim of Quadratus that some of the people Jesus healed and raised from the dead have lived up to his own day sounds something like the claim of Papias to have gotten information about the Lord's commands from the living and abiding voice of the elders and other disciples of the Lord. More strikingly, however, when Philip quotes, the phraseology sounds more like Eusebius's quotations of Quadratus than of Papias. In other words, it looks as though Philip transferred what Quadratus wrote over to Papias. Thus, just as Eusebius associates Quadratus with Hadrian's reign, and quotes Quadratus as referring to people raised from the dead by Jesus and still living, so Philip associates Papias with Hadrian's reign, and writes that Papias referred to people raised from the dead by Jesus and still living. So if we place Philip to the side, pun intended, and consider what Eusebius tells us about the time of Papias' writing, we get a date much earlier than 135 AD. Eusebius discusses Papias in the 3rd book of his ecclesiastical history, but this work seems to be limited to the time prior to the close of Emperor Trajan's reign, meaning that Papias' writings would need to be written within that time period. As Robert Yarborough argues, Eusebius classes Papias with the young Polycarp, Ignatius, and even Clement, that is, with those who were the immediate successors to the apostles. Nowhere in Book 3 of Eusebius' history, in which Papias is treated, does he discuss matters later than Trajan's reign. In fact, Book 4 opens with the 12th reign of Trajan. Without question, Papias is viewed as flourishing before 109. Yarborough further points out that Eusebius offers a list of early Christians, seemingly in chronological order, which places Papias after the Apostle John, but prior to Polycarp or Ignatius, suggesting that Papias was writing earlier than either of them. As he explains, Eusebius's Chronicon furnishes a second and related clue for dating Papias. Eusebius places the aged Apostle John, Papias, Polycarp, and Ignatius, in that order, in the same entry. Next to this entry, Eusebius has, as part of his running table of dates, the year 100. With this entry, he concludes his treatment of the 1st century. Unquestionably, Eusebius here links Papias with the Apostle John as a church leader at the close of the 1st century and as a contemporary of Ignatius and the young Polycarp. And as a further point, it is noteworthy that neither Irenaeus nor Eusebius ever cite Papias in their criticisms of Gnosticism, despite a strong propensity for both of them to do this when prominent church figures spoke out against Gnosticism. This suggests that Papias was writing prior to the prominence of Gnosticism during the early and mid-2nd century, suggesting a 1st century date for his writings. Again, Yarborough says, another clue in dating Papias is that neither Irenaeus nor Eusebius adduces Papias as an anti-Gnostic witness. Now, when Irenaeus is able to cite earlier authorities, especially biblical writers, against his ideological opponents, he gladly does so. Eusebius's penchant for quoting copious portions of earlier works is well known. Yet for all the vehement opposition of these two against the early Gnostics, it appears that neither turns to Papias for support in his arguments. The most obvious explanation for this is that Papias said nothing about the Gnostics, whose teachings Irenaeus and Eusebius were trying to refute. That is, Papias wrote far too early for such Gnostics to be of concern. Speaking of Irenaeus, he refers to Papias in his own writings as an ancient man, which doesn't make much sense if Papias were writing in 135, only 40 or 50 years before Irenaeus himself was writing. It makes far better sense if Papias was writing at the end of the 1st century, which would place him 70 to 80 years prior to Irenaeus. While still not exactly ancient in the literal sense of the word, Irenaeus routinely uses the term ancient to refer to the apostolic era, and again, this would indicate that he believed that Papias was writing near the time of the apostles, namely in the 1st century. All of these considerations push me towards dating Papias' writings to sometime in the late 90s AD, or the first few years of the 2nd century at the very latest. As Stephen Carlson says, Irenaeus commended Papias as a hearer of John and a comrade of Polycarp. This puts Papias at the beginning of the 2nd century, and it makes Papias' comments about the writings of Mark and Matthew the earliest external evidence we have for the Gospels. This very antiquity is the main reason for the intense amount of scholarly interest in him. F. David Farnell adds, if Papias wrote around AD 95 to 110, then the information that he imparts reaches well back into the 1st century and is an invaluable source of information regarding the Gospels. To summarize all of that, Philip of Side provides very tenuous grounds for dating Papias' writings as late as 135 AD. By contrast, Eusebius provides far better grounds for thinking that Papias was writing on the cusp of the 2nd century, if not the very end of the 1st. And Eusebius' dating of Papias' writings is indirectly corroborated by Irenaeus' witness. The previous sections concluded both that Papias was writing near the end of the 1st century, and that he joined the other church fathers in naming Matthew as the first gospel to have been written. Since Papias was plausibly writing in the late 90s, it stands to reason that Matthew must have been written before then. In fact, Papias forthrightly tells us that he got this information about Matthew from an even earlier source, an elder named John, who many scholars regard as none other than John the Apostle. As Gundry helpfully summarizes, since Papias uses the present tense concerning the elder speaking, and since the Apostle John, who is the elder, died at least by the end of the 1st century, or the first few years of the 2nd, Papias must have acquired this tradition before that time. Furthermore, if I am correct about the new Papian fragment, then Papias attests to the priority of Matthew, meaning that it would have to be written before Mark, Luke, and John. Assuming that there were at least a few years between the composition of each gospel, the Gospel of Matthew can comfortably be dated to the 70s at the latest. However, our other two primary witnesses, Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria, clearly indicate a date of composition earlier even than this. As Donald Hagner summarizes, but Papias says nothing about when the Gospel of Matthew, if that is what he had in mind in his reference to the Logia, was written, whereas Irenaeus does, dating it during the ministries of Peter and Paul in Rome. Similarly, when Clement of Alexandria says that Mark was written during the lifetime of Peter, then at least in his view, Matthew would have been written even earlier. No one in the early church was apparently prepared to date Matthew after 70. Now, although I disagree with Hagner when he says that Papias says nothing about when Matthew was written, he is absolutely correct that Irenaeus and Clement undoubtedly date the composition of the Gospel to sometime before 70 AD within the lifetimes of Peter and Paul. Recall that Peter and Paul likely died around 64 AD in the wake of the Neronian persecution, making this the latest possible date for the composition of Matthew according to Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria. As R.T. France notes, the one specific statement of the period of Matthew's origin is that of Irenaeus, that it was while Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel and founding the church in Rome. This would place it in the early 60s at the latest, and while no other such specific statement is made in the early references to the gospel which we considered in the last chapter, their understanding of the relation of Matthew to Mark shows that they would not have envisaged a date later than Irenaeus indicates. Indeed, some would have dated it even earlier, for whereas Irenaeus dates the origin of the Gospel of Mark shortly after the death of Peter, i.e., in the mid-60s, an alternative tradition, represented particularly by Clement of Alexandria, informs us that Mark wrote his Gospel while Peter was still alive. If this latter tradition is to be believed, and if Matthew wrote before Mark, this would put the origin of Matthew even earlier than Irenaeus' dating requires. Altogether, then, the patristic evidence seems unanimous that Matthew was written no later than the early 60s. France's remarks here do raise a concern that we touched on earlier, namely an apparent contradiction between Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria regarding the date of Mark's composition. Irenaeus appears to say that Mark was written soon after the death of Peter, whereas Clement of Alexandria is clear that it was written while Peter was still alive. Earlier, I emphasized how this supports the independence of Clement's account from Irenaeus's, meaning that we are dealing with multiple independent attestation. On the other hand, this observation might be a double-edged sword when it comes to dating the Gospels, since, apparently, at least one source cannot be correct about the origins of Mark, and if a source is wrong about the date of Mark's composition, why trust it when it comes to the date of Matthew? This whole concern is motivated by the idea that Irenaeus and Clement do in fact contradict one another on the date of Mark's composition. Superficially, I agree that they appear to contradict one another. However, a careful reading of Irenaeus' remarks reveals that he does not, in fact, say that Mark was written after Peter and Paul's deaths. He only says that Mark's gospel was handed on to Christians after their deaths. So a plausible harmonization of Irenaeus and Clement is available. One could easily maintain that Mark's gospel was written during Peter's lifetime, specifically for the Praetorian Guard, as Clement says, and that it was only handed on to believers in general after Peter and Paul's deaths, as Irenaeus says. As Bernard Orchard concludes, Irenaeus is not making any reference to the date of the composition of Mark and Luke. He is simply concerned with pointing out that, just as the traditions of Matthew and John continue to live on in their respective Gospels, so do those of Peter and Paul in the Gospels of Mark and Luke. That is to say, as long as Peter and Paul lived, they preached their own Gospels personally by word of mouth, but after their demise, their preaching also continued in the Gospels, in which their followers had already recorded their teaching. In conclusion, this text of Irenaeus, recorded by Eusebius in its original Greek, should no longer be claimed in support of the conjecture that both Mark and Luke were composed after the death of Peter and Paul, for it offers no evidence for this claim. This means that there is no contradiction or discrepancy between the testimony of Irenaeus and the large amount of witness in favor of Mark and Luke having both been written and published during the lifetime of Peter and Paul. Consequently, the evidence of Irenaeus is in harmony with the rest. And John Wenham adds, Irenaeus does not say that after the death of Peter and Paul, Mark wrote his gospel, but that he handed on the preaching of Peter to us in writing. Any suggestion of discontinuity between the time of preaching and the time of writing would weaken his argument, and no such notion should be read into it. Of course, it does not preclude the possibility that the gospel was written after the death of Peter, but the important point is that the passage does not say so. One interesting development is that this harmonization of Irenaeus and Clement proposed by Orchard and Wenham is independently supported in a relatively recently discovered manuscript called the Mar Saba Letter. This letter is allegedly written by Clement of Alexandria to someone named Theodore. In this letter, it is explicitly said that Mark wrote his gospel while Peter was still alive, but only handed it on to Christians after Peter's death. The authenticity of the letter is highly controversial, and, for the record, my own judgment is that it is probably a forgery. But if it is authentic, it would provide independent confirmation for the harmonization suggested by Orchard and Wenham. As John Robinson concludes, this new fragment supports the dating of Mark during Peter's lifetime, though it could also help to explain other traditions which seem to put it after the death of Peter. James Crossley objects to this harmonization of Irenaeus and Clement, saying, "It is difficult to imagine that Mark would not have been widely disseminated if already written, not least in a relatively long established Roman community. Otherwise, this would mean the unlikely situation of a written gospel being withheld from the Roman Christians for some time. Thus, even if it were to be accepted that Mark passed on Peter's preaching in written form, surely the implication would be that this was the first time of it being put into writing." However, the difficulty is only present if one disconnects what Irenaeus says from what Clement of Alexandria says. If one allows Clement's remarks to contextualize Irenaeus's, then it is evident that Mark's gospel was specifically written for non-Christians, and presumably was not disseminated to Christians until after Peter's death, when his loss was felt, and there was a pressing need for his voice and message to be remembered. Hence, the difficulty that Crossley notes for my interpretation of Irenaeus is born out of his failure to consider Irenaeus's remarks alongside Clement of Alexandria's. As David Black puts it, Clement of Alexandria is quoted as saying that the Gospel of Mark resulted from public lectures given by Peter himself to a Roman audience. Clement and other ancient witnesses understood Mark's function to have been simply that of reporting Peter's words with total accuracy. That is, Mark was not the author of the Gospel, but simply the agent of its publication, because all of this material came from Peter's own memories of what Jesus had said and done. We can also infer that Peter switched between the two scrolls by Matthew and Luke, and that he naturally tended to follow the order of whichever scroll he had in his hand. One further possibility, which I do not endorse but is worthy of mention, is the possibility that, by the term departure, Irenaeus is not referring to the death of Peter and Paul at all, but rather to a literal departure from Rome. Referring to death as departure would be an uncharacteristic term for Irenaeus to use if he were referring to the literal deaths of Peter and Paul. I myself am not persuaded of this possibility, especially because it is rather normal to soften the term death to something like deceased or passing when discussing the death of a loved or respected person. But the point is just that so long as this is a possibility, Irenaeus need not be referring to Peter's death at all, in which case he cannot be contradicting Clement of Alexandria. To round out this section, then, we have seen that the Church Fathers clearly date the composition of Matthew's Gospel to the lifetime of the apostles Peter and Paul, meaning that it cannot be dated any later than 64 AD. Claims of a contradiction between Irenaeus and Clement may superficially appear well-founded, but a closer reading of Irenaeus reveals that what he says is in harmony with Clement of Alexandria. There is a further piece of evidence indicating a pre-64 date for the composition of Matthew. This comes from a different church father, who was also named Clement, Clement of Rome, who wrote a letter to the church at Corinth. Although the author does not name himself, there is abundant external evidence identifying Clement of Rome as the author. William Varner helpfully summarizes it as follows. No author is mentioned in the document itself. However, Hegg, who visited Rome during the days of Bishop Anicetus, refers to a letter that Clement wrote to the Corinthians during the Domitian persecution around 96. Irenaeus adds that, during the time of Clement, the church in Rome wrote a letter to the church in Corinth with the purpose of restoring the peace because of a spiritual rebellion that had taken place there. Towards the end of the 2nd century, another Clement, this time from Alexandria, often referred to the letter in his work called Stromata, sometimes attributing its authorship to an earlier Clement, but sometimes simply stating that the letter came from the church in Rome. While his letter to the Corinthians, or First Clement, is commonly dated to around 96 AD, this dating is largely based on the assumption that the Synoptic Gospels were written after 70 AD. This is because Clement of Rome is apparently familiar with them. For example, 1 Clement 46:8 closely mirrors the millstone sayings found in Matthew 18:6-7 and 26:24. 1 Clement 13:2 appears to be a composite citation that draws upon Matthew 5:7 and 7:2, as well as Luke 6:36-38. 1 Clement 24:5 contains an allusion to the parable of the sower, as found in Matthew 13:39. More examples could be given, but hopefully the point is clear. Clement appears to be familiar with the Gospel of Matthew. As R.T. France summarizes, Clement of Rome shows familiarity, especially with the Sermon on the Mount, but also with several other sayings of Jesus found in Matthew. Probably the most serious scholarly exploration of this issue comes to us from Donald Hagner in his scholarly monograph, The Use of the Old and New Testaments in Clement of Rome. Hagner's conclusion is that there are two places in 1 Clement where literary dependence upon Matthew's Gospel is probable, as he concludes, from these Old Testament citations and allusions common to both Clement and the New Testament, it may be concluded that in only one instance does it seem at all probable that Clement betrays a knowledge of the Synoptic Gospels. If we add to this the allusion to the Synoptics in 24:5, it may be said that we have evidence, slight though it may be, that Clement probably knew at least one, if not more than one, of the Synoptics. Hagner's conclusion here is extremely modest because, although there are numerous other places where 1 Clement has near verbatim agreement with Matthew's Gospel, Hagner regards it as slightly more likely that Clement is here utilizing oral traditions that were incorporated into Matthew's Gospel, rather than depending upon Matthew's Gospel itself. However, this assumes that the material in the Gospels is primarily representative of earlier oral traditions, which is highly debatable, especially if one accepts traditional authorship, as I do. If this assumption is jettisoned, then it is virtually certain that 1 Clement depends upon the Gospel of Matthew. But even if we accept Hagner's more modest position, we can still say that it is more likely than not that 1st Clement knows Matthew's Gospel. Because Matthew is routinely assumed to have been written sometime in the mid-80s, it follows that 1st Clement had to be written sometime after this, hence the conventional mid-90s date for 1st Clement. However, if we do not assume that the Gospels were written after 70 AD, the material internal to 1st Clement itself suggests a much earlier date. The only other reason for dating 1st Clement to the mid-90s is based on a statement from Eusebius, according to which Clement of Rome was Bishop of Rome towards the end of Emperor Domitian's reign, which ended in 96 AD. However, this assumes that 1st Clement was written while Clement was Bishop of Rome, something that is never stated within 1st Clement itself. As Thomas Heron points out, the AD 95 date rests on one simple piece of information, namely that Eusebius tells us that Clement of Rome was single Bishop of Rome towards the end of the reign of Emperor Domitian, whose death, we know, was in AD 96. Take away the belief that Clement wrote the letter known as 1st Clement while he was Bishop of Rome, and the dating of circa 95 is seriously undermined. The issue is not whether Eusebius is correct about Clement's tenure as bishop, but whether that information has any possible relevance for the dating question. Thomas Heron wrote the definitive scholarly work defending an early date for 1st Clement, entitled Clement and the Early Church of Rome. Time precludes a full examination of Heron's case in this video, but it is primarily based upon a careful analysis of several internal clues. Much of this comes down to identifying the particular time of persecution that is referenced throughout the letter. Clement opens in the very first verse by referencing a sudden and unfortunate series of events that is revealed to be persecution against Christians throughout the letter. This has been taken by proponents of the mid-90s date to refer to the persecution under Emperor Domitian. However, Heron points out that many of Clement's statements make far better sense if he is referring to the Neronian persecution, which happened in the mid-60s AD, 30 years earlier than 1st Clement is normally dated. This is especially clear in Chapter 5, a chapter of 1st Clement that we explored in considerable detail in my video defending the historicity of the persecution and martyrdom of the apostles. In this chapter, Clement describes the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, both of whom were killed under the Emperor Nero in the mid-60s AD. But what is most interesting for our present purposes is that Clement introduces this section by describing Peter and Paul as the most recent spiritual heroes and as noble examples furnished in our own generation. This is significant because Clement is choosing to use the deaths of Peter and Paul as examples precisely because these are the most recent examples of prominent martyrs relative to the time of his writing. But since we know that Peter and Paul died in the mid-60s under Nero, clearly this favors viewing the persecution of which Clement writes as being the Neronian persecution. If 1st Clement were written 30 years later, it would not make much sense to refer to Peter and Paul as the most recent examples of prominent martyrs. This suggests that Clement was writing during the Neronian persecution, which would mean that his letter dates to 67 AD at the latest. As Heron puts it, obviously if both 1st Clement and his readers belong to the same generation as Peter and Paul, it seems clear that he is not referring to a past period so far back that a large number of his readers would not even have been alive, as would be the case by the mid-90s. Again, the dating of the mid-90s is the problem. The date of circa 70 poses no such difficulties. Nor is a date in the mid to late 60s for 1st Clement something that only conservative or evangelical scholars support. No less a skeptic than Richard Carrier forcefully argues that 1st Clement was written in the 60s AD, saying, Clement is also completely unaware of the fact that the temple at Jerusalem was destroyed and the liturgical rites are no longer performed there, or even that the Jews were, or had ever been at war with Rome, both of which, in my estimation, should definitely place his letter before the year 70. Now, Carrier is also a proponent of later dates for the Gospels, and so he tries to suggest that 1st Clement is not, in fact, dependent upon the Synoptic Gospels. He directly addresses this question in chapter 8 of his book on the historicity of Jesus, and in an article on his blog. He essentially just lists a bunch of things from the Gospels which he thinks that Clement ought to have mentioned, but doesn't, and concludes by saying, so there is no possible way to validly argue that 1st Clement had ever heard of any of the Gospels, or any of the particular content of any of the Gospels. However, Carrier's reasoning here is nothing but arguments from silence, which, as I have shown in a previous video, are usually pretty weak when they take this form. And completely lacking from Carrier's discussion of the matter is any serious interaction with the allusions to and verbatim correspondences with the Synoptics noted by France, Hagner, and other scholars. Heron, despite his excellent defense of an early date for 1st Clement, is also skeptical of 1st Clement's dependence upon the Synoptics. To his credit, he does take a couple of pages to address Donald Hagner's arguments for 1st Clement's knowledge of the Synoptics. He acknowledges the literary parallels, however, he counters by proposing that perhaps the Synoptics borrowed this material from 1st Clement, rather than 1st Clement borrowing this material from the Synoptics. But this is really not at all satisfactory. Are we really to believe that Matthew and Mark carefully combed through 1st Clement to include these precise allusions and verbatim words within their narratives, and only in such minute ways? Why would they do this, especially when 1st Clement doesn't appear to have been regarded as authoritative by anyone until the time of Dionysius of Corinth in 170 AD? The Gospels, by contrast, were regarded as authoritative since at least the time of the earliest apostolic fathers. Ignatius and Polycarp cite the Gospels with authority all the time, and while they are aware of and make use of 1st Clement, it is clearly not revered in the way that the Gospels are. So it's easy to see why Clement would allude to and quote from the Gospels. It is comparatively much more difficult to see why the Gospel authors would make any use whatsoever of 1st Clement, meaning that 1st Clement's dependence on the Synoptics has greater explanatory power than Heron's suggestion. I conclude, therefore, that 1st Clement was indeed written in the 60s AD, probably no later than 67 AD. I think it is more likely than not that 1st Clement knows the Synoptic Gospels, including the Gospel of Matthew, meaning that Matthew can't be dated any later than the mid-60s AD. So to wrap up our discussion of 1st Clement, I have argued that 1st Clement should be dated to sometime soon after the deaths of Peter and Paul, based on Clement's claim that their deaths were recent. This would locate 1st Clement sometime during the Neronian persecution, which ended in 67 AD. I have further shown that there is reason to believe that Clement was familiar with the Gospel of Matthew, meaning that it would have to be dated to some time before 67. And I have concluded with an examination of criticisms of this thesis. So far, we have been focusing heavily on external evidence to date Matthew before 70 AD, whether that be direct statements from church fathers placing Matthew in the lifetimes of the apostles, or citations of Matthew from Christian writings which are earlier than 70 AD. However, we have not yet discussed evidence internal to Matthew itself, which speaks in favor of a date before 70 AD. While I have, thus far, relied rather heavily on the external evidence, it is considerably more difficult to cast doubt on evidence for an early date when it is based upon what a document directly says. As Ned Stonehouse points out, in coming to ultimate judgments concerning a document, nothing can be alleged against that which it discloses itself as being by its very content. Many clues in Matthew's Gospel point to an early date. Many of these clues come from Matthew's Olivet Discourse in chapter 24. Of course, it is telling that while all of the Synoptics include Jesus' prediction of the fall of Jerusalem, none of them give any hint that this prediction was ever fulfilled. This is quite surprising, since it was among the most monumentous events of the first century, and so Jesus correctly predicting it would greatly increase his credibility. Yet there is never any statement in all the New Testament that Jesus' prediction was vindicated. As John Wenham observes, the eschatological discourse foretells the shocking disaster which 40 years later was to engulf the Jewish people, yet not one of the Gospels tells us that Jesus' prophecy was fulfilled. Similarly, John Robinson notes, one of the oddest facts about the New Testament is that what on any showing would appear to be the single most datable and climactic event of the period, the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, and with it, the collapse of institutional Judaism based on the temple, is never once mentioned as a past fact. Yet Matthew is unique among the Synoptics in that he has Jesus giving specific advice to those who will live through this time. For example, in 24:20, Jesus says, "Moreover, pray that when you flee, it will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath." So here Matthew has Jesus cautioning against fleeing from Jerusalem during a particular time of the year or on a particular day of the week. This warning makes perfectly good sense if it is written before the events had taken place, so that those who end up living in Jerusalem at this time can benefit from Jesus' advice. On the other hand, as Hagner says, such an insertion makes little sense if in fact Matthew is writing after, let alone years after the event itself. What would be Matthew's motive in going out of his way to issue such a warning to pray? The inclusion of this statement is rendered all the more puzzling on the supposition that Matthew wrote after 70 AD, since the actual flight of Christians from Jerusalem took place before the abomination of desolation, even though Matthew has Jesus commanding them not to flee until afterwards. As Gundry remarks, this insertion lacks purpose if the destruction of Jerusalem and previous flight of the Christians to Pella had already taken place, and if he wrote after AD 70, we should have expected him to conform the time of the flight from Jerusalem to the historical reality of the flight to Pella before the Romans defiled the sanctuary, rather than retain a command to flee only after the abomination of desolation. Some critics, operating on the assumption of Markan priority, have suggested that Matthew's Olivet Discourse may actually suggest a late date because of the way that he supposedly redacts Mark's Gospel to introduce a distinction between the fall of Jerusalem and the end of the age. Whereas in Mark, the disciples ask, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled?" In Matthew, they ask, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So the suggestion is that Matthew, writing after the fall of Jerusalem, and knowing that Christ had not yet returned, redacts Mark to introduce a distinction between the coming of Christ and the end of the world, so as to stave off the impression that Jesus was wrong. And obviously, this would mean that Matthew is writing sometime after 70 AD. The problems with this argument are legion, ranging from its assumption of Markan priority to its assuming the falsity of some sort of preterist eschatology. But without delving again into the controversial issue of the synoptic problem, or defending a realized eschatology, there is a fatal flaw in this argument, namely that Matthew actually makes the supposed problem in Mark's Gospel even worse. For whereas Mark leaves his description of the fall of Jerusalem considerably more vague than Matthew does, Matthew leaves no doubt that he is describing the events of 70 AD, and then he aggravates the supposed problem by directly saying that the return of Christ would happen immediately after the days of tribulation. As Hagner puts it, Matthew's redaction of the Markan eschatological discourse makes no attempt to disentangle the references to the fall of Jerusalem and the end of the age. Luke very deliberately does so in his redaction of Mark 13, and we might expect Matthew to do the same had it been written after 70. Indeed, the Evangelist aggravates the problem considerably by his insertion of immediately in 24:29, which leaves the clear impression that he expected the parousia of the Son of Man to occur in close succession to the fall of Jerusalem. He goes on to drive his point home saying, he could never have made that insertion if he were writing 10 or 30 years after the fall of the city. While I personally have some reservations about Hagner's comments here regarding Luke's Olivet discourse, and I obviously disagree with his assumption of Markan priority, he is nevertheless completely correct when he points out that Matthew does not allow for any significant delay between the fall of Jerusalem and the coming of Christ. If anything, he makes whatever ambiguity exists in Mark's account about the close association of the two events even more explicit. If Matthew were trying to suggest that there was going to be a large gap of time between the two events, he did a very poor job of getting that across to the reader. In fact, the whole way that Matthew speaks about the temple throughout his gospel seems to assume that it still stands. For example, in Matthew 21:12-13, when Jesus condemns the Jewish religious leaders for turning the temple into a den of robbers, he uses a present tense verb, indicating that this is still ongoing, which obviously implies that the temple still exists when he is writing. Notably, neither Mark nor Luke uses the present tense in their parallel passages. Additionally, Matthew, having Jesus condemn people who swear by the temple or the altar, serves no practical purpose if these things did not still exist when he was writing. As Hagner observes, there is a specific mention of offering at the altar and leaving one's gift at the altar in 5:23-4. Why would Matthew include reference to this if the temple were no longer standing when he wrote? A further example of anachronism, if the temple no longer stands when Matthew writes, are the references to swearing by the temple and swearing by the altar in 23:16-22. It is, of course, possible that Matthew simply records the material because it was a part of the tradition available to him. At the same time, however, one wonders if, in that case, he would not have at least altered the material to make it relevant to his readers. Similarly, Matthew's many polemics against the Jewish sect of Sadducees seem out of place if he is writing after 70 AD, since this sect ceased to exist in any significant way after that time. Why heavily criticize a group of people who no longer exist and whose ideas no longer hold any influence? As Gundry puts it, the Sadducees lost influence after AD 70. A large proportion of them perished in the destruction of Jerusalem. Matthew's special interest in them does not make good sense then, outside the supposition of a date before 70 AD. In addition to all this, Matthew's apparent approval of the paying of the temple tax in Matthew chapter 17 is much better explained on the hypothesis that he is writing before 70 AD. As France argues, the inclusion of the story about the temple tax points more strongly to a pre-70 date, since it implicitly approves the payment of this tax. Before AD 70, this would have been a meaningful gesture of solidarity with Israel, but after 70, it would carry quite a different connotation, for the tax was not abolished when the temple was destroyed, but rather diverted to the temple of Jupiter in Rome. All Jews were obliged to continue to pay it, but whereas it had previously been an offering for the worship of the true God, it was now resented as a contribution to idolatry. It is hard to see how Matthew, for all his desire to preserve stories of Jesus for their own sake, could have allowed this implication to stand without comment if he were writing after 70. To wrap up our discussion of the internal evidence, then, we may summarize our findings under three broad headings. First, it is telling that none of the synoptics confirm that Jesus' prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem was fulfilled, which is very surprising if it had already occurred at the time of their writing. Second, Matthew's Olivet Discourse in particular includes specific advice and timing statements that are only likely to have been included before the events of 70 AD. Third, Matthew uniquely includes present tense language in reference to the temple, as well as prohibitions on activities that were only practiced while the temple was still standing. Such material obviously better suits a pre-70 date for the gospel. Fourth and finally, Matthew's condemnation of the Sadducees and his endorsement of the temple tax also best fit a period prior to 70 AD. While none of these factors are decisive in and of themselves, cumulatively, they do lend credence to the testimony of the Patristics, claiming that Matthew was written during the lifetimes of Peter and Paul. I want to draw our attention to one further line of argument that potentially indicates that the Gospel of Matthew could not have been written any later than the 60s AD. This evidence comes to us from the manuscript P64, also known as the Magdalen Papyrus, which consists of 3 small scraps of papyrus that contain enough text for us to conclude that it was once a manuscript of the Gospel of Matthew. It is a matter of critical orthodoxy that the earliest surviving manuscript evidence for any of the Gospels is a fragment from the Gospel of John called P52, commonly dated to the early to mid-2nd century. But the German scholar Carsten Peter Thiede has argued that P64 is earlier, much earlier. Specifically, he argues that, based on the lettering style on the papyrus, P64 dates to 66 AD. For example, the letters in P64 often touch or almost touch one another, a feature characteristic of writing in the 1st century and before, but which was nearly abandoned by the 2nd century. As another example, the stroke of the letters in P64 remains consistent in width, regardless of whether the strokes are horizontal or vertical. This technique is virtually unknown in ancient literature, but there is at least one other clear example of this, namely the leather scroll of Leviticus found in Qumran Cave 4. The scroll dates from somewhere between 30 AD and the later 1st century, making a mid-1st century date the safest bet. But given the similarity in lettering between this scroll and P64, it would seem reasonable to date P64 to the same time frame. As Thiede explains, the leather fragment 4Q LXX from Qumran Cave 4 provides us with a useful example of a Greek hand which indicates a mid-1st century date for the Magdalen Papyrus. Thiede draws several further parallels between P64 and other manuscripts known to be from the 1st century, and he draws the threads together, concluding, the comparable material yields a date of AD 66 with a distinct tendency towards an even slightly earlier date. Conversely, there is no equally conclusive comparable material from later periods. Thus, the usual paleographic margin of error would allow for earlier, but not for later dates. Now, I am less enthusiastic about this discovery than Thiede, since trying to date manuscripts based solely on the style of the lettering tends to be a risky business. Nevertheless, this is often the only evidence we have, and I think that it is worth comparing the lettering to other manuscripts to see if there is a best fit, and I do think that Theed brings up some comparisons that are worth considering. Theed's primary critic has been the esteemed biblical scholar at Cambridge, Graham Stanton. Stanton raised two primary criticisms of Theed's thesis. The first pertained to the weakness of Theed's arguments for a first century date, and the second was an argument in support of a late 2nd century date for P64. Regarding the first contention, Stanton criticized Theed for focusing on the similarity between the lettering of P64 and other 1st century manuscripts, while ignoring differences, saying, while there are similarities between the shape of some of the letters in P64 and their counterparts in the 1st century examples appealed to, there are also dissimilar letters which are not discussed. Regarding the second contention, Stanton argued that because P64 comes from a codex, in other words, a book rather than a scroll, it must be from the 2nd century, since, according to him, we know that codices weren't used until all 4 Gospels were written. As he puts it, in an article published in 1994, T.C. Skeet developed considerably some of his own earlier work on the origin of the Christian Codex. He noted that some 42 papyrus fragments of the Gospels have now come to light, and every one is from a codex. Why did Christians have such an extraordinary predilection for the codex form of book, as opposed to the roll? Skeet's answer, which I find convincing, is that Christians adopted the codex because it could contain the text of all 4 Gospels. No roll could do this. So at last we have uncovered the real significance of the Magdalen College fragments of Matthew's Gospel. They are certainly not from the 1st century. I find Stanton's first point of critique to be fair but not decisive. Theed does not need each letter of P64 to bear a resemblance to other 1st century lettering. He just needs 1st century lettering to be the best match for the lettering in P64. And I find Stanton's argument for a 2nd century date to be more than a little speculative. Perhaps early Christians had a preference for codices over scrolls, because these could more readily contain all 4 Gospels. But we must beware of hastily assuming that all Christian codices should be explained in the same way, especially if there are independent reasons to think that a manuscript dates to before the composition of all 4 Gospels. Certainly Stanton's theory is not at all sufficient to dogmatically establish, as he claims, that P64 is certainly not from the 1st century. Peter Hegg has issued a bit of a longer critique of Theed, basically developing Stanton's first critique at greater length. He concluded that, we agree with Theed when he wrote, caution is always the best approach in the dating of manuscripts. In this article, an attempt has been made both to hear and to critically investigate his claims regarding the date of P64. Although we recognize the service that he has performed in facilitating a re-examination of methodological presuppositions, our verdict on his claims is a negative one. The very early manuscripts to which Theed appealed for close parallels to P64 turned out not to be as close as the somewhat later ones which he had overlooked. Similar to Stanton, Hegg is right to note that the evidence is somewhat more mixed than Theed indicates. I do think that Hegg tends to downplay the similarities noted by Theed, and to overplay the similarities between P64 and some 2nd century papyri. My own conclusion is that we should remain open to a 1st century date for P64, since there is enough evidence to render this somewhat plausible. However, in light of some evidence potentially pointing the other way, we should not place more weight on P64 than it can bear. To be very clear, nothing about my case hinges critically upon Theed's paleography being accurate. My case for an early date for Matthew's Gospel can stand solely on the other arguments I have made heretofore. But I bring this possibility up here because, although my case for an early date is basically unaffected, even if Theed is wrong, the case for a late date for Matthew is absolutely sunk if he is right. So there is an important asymmetry between the case for an early date and the case for a late date, respectively, when it comes to the significance of Theed's contention. The possibility of P64 dating to 66 AD, in other words, should concern the proponent of a late date far more than it should excite the proponent of an early date. To conclude our discussion of P64 then, there is some evidence to suggest that it may date to 66 AD. Carsten Theed likely overstates the case for a first century date, especially in light of certain dissimilarities between some letters in P64 and other examples of first century manuscripts. However, critics like Graham Stanton and Peter Head have also dismissed Theed's case too quickly, giving undue weight to speculative theories about why P64 was originally part of a codex. The thesis that P64 dates to 66 AD appears to be at least possible and not obviously unreasonable. And since almost no one thinks that P64 is part of the original Gospel of Matthew, the first Gospel had to have been authored sometime prior to P64. So while it is very far from being a slam dunk for a pre-70 date for Matthew's Gospel, when considered alongside the testimony of the Patristics, First Clement's apparent knowledge of Matthew, and certain statements in Matthew's Olivet Discourse, I think that we are more than warranted in concluding that the Gospel of Matthew was written no later than the early 60s AD. Donald Hagner reminds us, since there is credible evidence that points to an early, i.e. pre-70 date for Matthew, and since we simply do not know enough to exclude that possibility, it would seem that a scholarly humility is appropriate. In determining the date of Matthew, scholars should exhibit openness to the possibility of a date earlier than critical orthodoxy currently allows. To bring this section to a close, then, I have argued that Carsten Theed's theory about the dating of P64 to 66 AD is interesting, and that there is some evidence to support that date. I have, however, attempted to give due consideration to Theed's critics. I believe that some of their criticisms have weight, and that others do not. My conclusion is that arguments for an early date for Matthew's Gospel, based on the dating of P64, should be used with the greatest of caution. However, because Theed's theory is supported by some evidence, I believe that it works as a deterrent to confidently dating Matthew's Gospel any later than the 60s AD. Now, pushing Matthew's Gospel into the early 60s AD, or even possibly the mid-50s AD, is already considered pretty scandalous in contemporary scholarship. Nevertheless, I think we can push it even earlier. Recall that Paul's earliest letter is typically thought to be 1 Thessalonians, and is typically dated to around 50 AD. But there is some evidence to suggest that Paul may be dependent upon the Gospel of Matthew in both 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. The following discussion will argue that both 1st and 2nd Thessalonians appear to betray knowledge of Matthew's Gospel. But whereas the authenticity of 1st Thessalonians is not in question for most scholars, the authenticity, and therefore the date of 2nd Thessalonians, has increasingly been questioned. The bulk of the ensuing argumentation will only depend on 1st Thessalonians, and, consequently, 2nd Thessalonians is not strictly necessary to show that Paul knows Matthew. However, 2nd Thessalonians does strengthen the case for Paul's knowledge of Matthew, and, given that skepticism exists, allow me to make a brief defense of the authenticity of 2nd Thessalonians. Perhaps the most influential scholar promoting skepticism about the authenticity of 2nd Thessalonians has been the German scholar William Reed. His original work was recently translated into English by Robert Ray, and this makes it easier for us to interact with his case against the authenticity of 2nd Thessalonians. Reed's two main arguments for questioning authenticity come from apparent theological disagreements between 1st and 2nd Thessalonians with respect to the imminence of Christ's return in 1st Thessalonians, but a doctrine of delay in 2nd Thessalonians, and from what Reed sees as evidence of literary dependence in 2nd Thessalonians upon 1st Thessalonians. From these observations, Reed confidently concludes, the author must have been a later writer, and the letter is fiction. The most sustained recent defense of the authenticity of 2nd Thessalonians comes to us from Daniel W. McDougall in his scholarly monograph, The Authenticity of 2nd Thessalonians. McDougall criticizes Reed on both counts. With respect to the supposed theological disagreement, he points out that a careful examination of 2nd Thessalonians, however, shows that the problem is not the delay of the Parousia, but the teaching that it has already arrived. The writer's response to this false teaching does not mention a series of preliminary signs at all, but instead presents the day of the Lord as a complex event which includes the gathering of the Christians, the final rebellion, and the revelation and defeat of Satan and his followers. This is really nothing more than is found elsewhere in Paul. In fact, it is similar to Paul's sharp criticism of the Corinthians for expressing an over-realized eschatology. The author of 2nd Thessalonians teaches the same eschatology as Paul, with no theology of delay. With respect to Reed's argument from literary dependence, McDougall points out that many of Reed's claimed instances of verbatim agreements between the two letters are simply not verbatim agreements. He concludes by saying, 5 of the conspicuous and particular parallels between 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are best explained not by literary dependence, but by understanding both 1st and 2nd Thessalonians as actual letters which follow certain literary conventions. 2 or more of these parallels show only that the same topic is being considered without any sign of literary dependence. The last particular parallel, the only true parallel, is best explained not as literary dependence, but as Paul applying set phraseology concerning his ministry to a particular problem. I think that enough has been said for viewers to appreciate that the authenticity of 2nd Thessalonians is defensible. Those wanting a fuller defense are directed to McDougall's monograph, but since I can make my basic argument for Paul's knowledge of Matthew from 1st Thessalonians alone, I will leave my defense of the authenticity of 2nd Thessalonians at that. Moving on then to the heart of my argument, Paul's eschatological statements in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians seem familiar with material that is only found in Matthew 24. Similarities in themes, as well as the phenomenon of distinctively Matthean vocabulary turning up in Paul's language, are highly suggestive. As Bernard Orchard argues, prescinding from attaching any specific dates to any of the Gospels, but being open to the possibility of early dating, the evidence will be outlined here for Paul's use of the literary tradition as found in our Greek Matthew. The case of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians offers the best and clearest example of Paul's adaptation of the eschatological teaching found chiefly in Matthew. In Matthew 23 through 25, and in the eschatological section of both letters, we find the same teaching, the same metaphors and similes, and the same key words, some exceedingly rare. Paul is seen to utilize the same key words and the same illustrations that Matthew uniquely uses with regard to the suddenness of the coming of the Lord. Like a thief in the night, like the sudden birth pangs, like the sudden arrival of the bridegroom, like the sudden coming of the flood while life was going on normally, a coming in power and glory with his angels, and with the sound of a great trumpet. Other powerful supporting reminiscences of Matthew are found in Galatians and 1 Corinthians. Of course, It is certain that Paul made full use of Old Testament eschatological imagery, but some extra details that he himself adds are found together only in Matthew and argue strongly for his first-hand knowledge of it. And in his excellent book, The Sayings of Jesus in the Churches of Paul, David Dungan argues extensively that Matthean themes can be found throughout the Pauline corpus. He suggests that the evidence here is just as strong as for supposing that various New Testament books influenced many of the patristic writers. As he explains, although a Tertullian and an Irenaeus may have succeeded most of the time in keeping their citations explicit and unscrambled, the same thing cannot be said for Justin Martyr, or 2nd Clement, or 1st Clement. In them, however, the degree of explicitness is clearly on the rise. But if we go back farther to someone like Polycarp or Ignatius or the other apostolic fathers, we can see much less explicit citation of traditional material. The argument that Paul knew only a few sayings because he only mentions a few openly falls to the ground, and the numerous verbal correspondences between his text and those of the Synoptic Gospels, as well as other more distantly related parallels in ethical exhortation, show that Paul actually cited, a considerable number of Jesus' teachings. Now, one might try to argue that the dependence goes the other way around. Perhaps Matthew copied this material into his Gospel from 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, rather than Paul borrowing this material from Matthew. However, there are a couple of observations that favor viewing this material as being original to Matthew. In the first place, this material is all uniquely concentrated together within his Gospel. It's much easier to see Paul borrowing bits and pieces from Matthew than to envision Matthew combing through Paul's letters with painstaking precision to bring all of this material together into a cohesive narrative. Second, and perhaps more importantly, Paul is using Greek words that are a part of Matthew's natural vocabulary rather than his own. For example, the term Gregorio, meaning be watchful, is a regular feature of Matthew's vocabulary, used a total of 6 times. Paul only uses this term once in his undisputed epistles outside of 1 Thessalonians. Similarly, episonago, meaning to gather together, is an exceptionally rare Greek word. Matthew uses the term twice, once in Matthew 24 and once in a completely different context. The term is also used by Mark and Luke twice, but assuming that I am correct about Matthean priority, they both appear to be copying the term from Matthew in one instance, meaning that the term is more a part of Matthew's natural vocabulary than theirs. Paul never uses this term, assuming he did not write the book of Hebrews, except for in 2 Thessalonians 2:1, where he employs the noun form. This just so happens to be the one passage in 2 Thessalonians that appears to be dependent on Matthew 24. Likewise, the phrase thief in the night in 1 Thessalonians 5:4 is a partially verbatim match for Matthew 24:43. If Matthew got it from Paul, why does Matthew embed it in a string of other synoptic sounding material absent from Paul? It just seems far easier to think that Paul lifted a memorable Matthean line. Other examples include the word appointed in 1 Thessalonians 5:9, which would come from Matthew 24:51. Paul doesn't use this word in connection with judgment anywhere else, and this particular way of using it seems to be Matthean. The word for come in 1 Thessalonians 5:2 and 2 Thessalonians 1:10 is rarely used by Paul to refer to the second coming. However, Matthew uses it that way many times, especially in chapter 24. Paul never associates angels with the second coming, except in 2 Thessalonians 1:7. Matthew does this 4 times, and the words mighty in heaven also appear nearby in Matthew 24. The word shaken is only used by Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2:24. However, Matthew uses this word twice, once in chapter 24. The word iniquity in 2 Thessalonians 2:7 is used about equally by Paul and Matthew. However, its use here is notably more Matthean than Pauline. John A.T. Robinson admits to being drawn to this same conclusion by his own study of the parallels between 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and Matthew's Gospel, saying, "In a study of the parallels between the apocalyptic material in Thessalonians and the Synoptic Gospels, I recorded what seemed to me the bizarre conclusion that the closest connections were between what appeared to be the earliest material in the epistles and the latest developments in the synoptic tradition, the material in Matthew." Examples could be multiplied, but I hope that viewers get the point. Much of the verbiage common to both Matthew 24 and Paul's eschatological teachings in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians is distinctively Matthean. This suggests that Paul is borrowing the terms from Matthew, rather than Matthew borrowing from Paul. Alternatively, one might suggest that both Paul and Matthew are copying from some other lost source that predated both of them. However, this idea is unparsimonious and ad hoc. It has pretty clearly been dreamed up solely to evade Paul's dependence upon Matthew in order to preserve a later date for Matthew's Gospel, despite there being no obvious reason to assume that Matthew dates to later than Paul. In short, there seems to be a solid case for thinking that in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Paul depends upon the Gospel of Matthew for his eschatological material. And since 1st and 2nd Thessalonians date to the very beginning of the 50s AD, the Gospel of Matthew must have been written even earlier, sometime in the 40s AD. To sum up, Paul's eschatological material in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians appears to be dependent on Matthew 24. Attempts to reverse the order of dependence run into the problem of many terms being more familiar to Matthew's vocabulary than to Paul's. Attempts to postulate a lost source for both are unparsimonious and ad hoc. Moreover, they are unmotivated apart from an unjustified assumption that Matthew's Gospel just has to be later than Paul's epistles. The conclusion is that Paul likely knows the Gospel of Matthew, and that, therefore, Matthew's Gospel can be dated no later than the late 40s AD. So far, we have been building a case for an early date for Matthew's Gospel, one layer at a time. But now we come to what I consider to be the cherry on top. The following argument, although drawn from observations made by other scholars, is, as far as I know, original to me. Though it should be noted that John Wenham comes very close to making this argument toward the end of his landmark book, redating Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Appropriately then, many of the building blocks for this argument are drawn from Wenham's book. The argument is interesting because, if successful, it indicates not just that Matthew's Gospel was written very early, but it indicates a very precise date, namely 42 AD. It is based upon an apparently unintentional corroboration, an undesigned coincidence if you like, between Papias and Irenaeus. I call this the Convergence Argument. Recall that earlier, when I discussed the evidence of Papias, and whether or not he testified to Markan priority, I defended Charles E. Hill's thesis, according to which Eusebius relays a fuller account of Papias' fourfold gospel tradition in Ecclesiastical History 324, 5-13. I had emphasized that, if this tradition is genuinely Papian, then Papias agreed with the other church fathers on the priority of Matthew's Gospel. But I did not highlight the fact that Papias here gives us a direct timestamp regarding when Matthew's Gospel was written. In verse 6, Papias, through Eusebius, says that Matthew was initially a preacher of the Gospel among the Hebrews, and that he wrote his Gospel for them before he left to become a missionary abroad. Thus we may disagree with Jonathan Bernier when he concludes, as interesting as Papias is in his own right, he is of little relevance for establishing the compositional date of Matthew's Gospel. Papias dates the composition of Matthew's Gospel to Matthew's departure from Jerusalem. I think that there is a good case to be made that the Apostle Matthew left Jerusalem for Ethiopia, or possibly Persia or Parthia, in 42 AD, meaning that his Gospel could not be dated any later than this based on what Papias tells us here. Why must Matthew have left Jerusalem in precisely 42 AD? Well, remember that the crucifixion happened around the year 30 AD. Now we have three plausibly independent sources, either directly saying or indicating that the apostles remained in Jerusalem for exactly 12 years before moving to preach to the rest of the world. As John Wenham says, our direct early evidence consists of three statements. 1. Eusebius refers to a book against the Montanists, written about 200, by Apollonius. He says, as though from tradition, that the Savior ordered his apostles not to leave Jerusalem for 12 years. 2. Acts of Peter, also to be dated perhaps 180 to 190, tells of a vision given to Peter in Jerusalem in which he is told to set sail for Rome in pursuit of Simon the sorcerer, now that 12 years in Jerusalem, which the Lord Christ had enjoined on him, were completed. 3. Clement of Alexandria, in his Stromateus, of about the same date, quotes the lost preaching of Peter. Peter records that the Lord had said to the disciples, "If now any one of Israel wishes to repent, and through my name to believe in God, his sins will be forgiven him. And after 12 years, go ye out into the world, that no one may say, we have not heard it." There are thus three statements from about 200 or earlier, one of them explicitly based on an even earlier document. Now, my argument does not require that Jesus actually gave such a command to the disciples to remain in Jerusalem for 12 years. Even if he did not, these sources still reveal knowledge that the disciples left Jerusalem after staying there for 12 years. Again, Wenham says, even if the supposed instruction by Jesus to stay for 12 years is apocryphal, the tradition may well be a witness to what in fact happened, that there was a general dispersal of the apostles at about this time. The idea that the apostles all left Jerusalem at the same time is also supported in the Apocryphon of James, which dates to the early or mid-2nd century. Though it does not say that this happened after 12 years, it does have the author, writing pseudo-anonymously as James, claiming to have sent all of the disciples out from Jerusalem at the same time towards the very end. Although the Apocryphon of James is not generally regarded as an especially historically reliable text, when taken in conjunction with the other evidence cited by Wenham, it can plausibly be seen as yet another testament to this early tradition that the apostles all left Jerusalem at approximately the same time. This idea may also be supported, albeit less directly, by Acts 8:1, which says that the Christians all fled from Jerusalem when persecution broke out against them, but then is very careful to say, except the apostles, meaning that the apostles were deliberately staying clustered in Jerusalem for a period of time. And although Acts does not give us any hint as to why they were choosing to remain in Jerusalem, and does not specify the duration of their stay in Jerusalem, it is nevertheless quite suggestive when taken with the other sources we have surveyed, which tell us that the apostles all dispersed from Jerusalem after 12 years. One might object that Wenham's suggestion that the apostles dispersed from Jerusalem in 42 AD creates tension with Acts 15, which describes the Jerusalem Council, where Peter and certain other unspecified apostles are said to be present. The council is typically dated to the late 40s or early 50s AD. But if the apostles, including Peter, dispersed in 42, then how could Peter and certain other apostles be present for the council in the late 40s or early 50s? However, the idea that the apostles dispersed in 42 AD in no way implies that none of them ever visited Jerusalem again. Indeed, the Jerusalem church remained the major hub of the Christian movement for years to come, and so periodic visits to Jerusalem by the apostles would be expected every once in a while. Indeed, Paul himself made several trips to Jerusalem. Acts 15 itself gives us no indication as to how many apostles were present at this council. It only indicates that it was more than one, and that Peter was among them. Incidentally, Peter's return to Jerusalem at this time is rather plausible if he had been in Rome earlier in the 40s. This is because both Acts and Suetonius tell us that Emperor Claudius evicted the Jews from Rome, presumably including Peter, around 49 AD. Thus it makes perfectly good sense for Peter to be in Jerusalem for the council around 49 to 50 AD, even if he had gone to Rome in 42 AD. After all, he would have been expelled from Rome around this time, and so he would have had to go somewhere for a while. Jerusalem, his old home, was surely an attractive option. Consequently, Peter leaving for Rome in 42, but returning to Jerusalem in 49, fits the events of that time rather well. Lastly, it should be noted that apostles doesn't always refer to the 12 in Acts anyway, for Barnabas is also identified as an apostle. So the claim that other apostles were present at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 need not refer to any of the 12 besides Peter. In short, the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 need not be a barrier to the substantial amount of testimony that the apostles dispersed from Jerusalem in 42 AD. Now, if the crucifixion happened in about 30 AD, and the disciples, which obviously included Matthew, dispersed 12 years later, then Matthew would have left Jerusalem in about 42 AD. Thus, coupling this fact with what Papias tells us about when Matthew wrote, at long last we reach a concrete date for the composition of Matthew's Gospel, namely in 42 AD. Turning now to what Irenaeus tells us, when we discussed Irenaeus previously, I had pointed out that he says that Matthew was written while Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel and establishing the Church of Rome. I had pointed out that this cannot refer to a date any later than 64 AD, when both Peter and Paul died. But while it cannot refer to a time later than 64 AD, it can refer to a time earlier than 64 AD. And I believe that a careful reading of Irenaeus suggests a much earlier date. Recall that Irenaeus says that Matthew wrote his gospel while the church at Rome was being established. But the church at Rome was not established in 64 AD when Peter and Paul died. It was founded quite a long time before this. Paul even wrote the book of Romans as a letter to this church around 57 AD. In Romans 1:8, Paul mentions that the faith of the believers from this church is reported all over the world, and that he had been planning to visit them for years, which implies that it had been founded quite some time before he was writing. Wenham sums this up well, saying, Paul's knowledge of the church is not something recently acquired. I have longed for many years to come to you. Many years probably implies the existence of the church for a decade or more, and the worldwide proclamation of its faith suggests strong growth in spite of the exodus under Claudius. But we can nail down a more precise date than this. There is a long tradition within Christian history dating Peter's founding of the church at Rome to the period after his escape from prison, as John Wenham notes. For many centuries, the Church of Rome held that Peter in fact arrived there after his escape from prison in 42, when it is said that he went to another place, and that he was, in some sense, the overseer of that church for 25 years. If, by any chance, the old tradition were correct, it would throw an entirely different light on the dating of Mark's Gospel. The substantial truth of the patristic tradition about Mark could be maintained without necessitating a date somewhere after the mid-60s, and a date as early as the mid-40s becomes possible. We independently know, through both Eusebius and Jerome, that Peter founded the church at Rome in precisely 42 AD. As Robinson observes, in the Latin version of his chronicle, followed by Jerome, Eusebius indeed dates Peter's arrival in Rome in the second year of Claudius, 42. Astonishingly, this exactly matches the 42 date when Matthew would have departed for Ethiopia. Coincidentally, this also just so happens to be when Papias tells us that he wrote his gospel for the Christians in Judea. Hence, despite giving us completely different time markers for when Matthew wrote his gospel, and despite neither giving us a precise date, both Papias's and Irenaeus's dates for the composition of the Gospel of Matthew independently converge on a date of 42 AD, hence why I call this the Convergence Argument for 42 AD. I simply think that this precise convergence of dates is too exact to be a coincidence, and is best explained by the hypothesis that Papias and Irenaeus are independently and truthfully telling us that Matthew was written in 42 AD. Now, as excited as I was when I first made this discovery, I have had to temper my excitement somewhat. There is a difficulty, namely that Irenaeus says that both Peter and Paul were responsible for founding the church at Rome. As James Crossley suggests, it appears that Irenaeus places the activities of Peter around the same time as Paul, which would be sometime around the 60s. But Paul does not appear to have been involved in the founding of the church at Rome. In fact, in Romans 1, 10 through 13, and Romans 15, 23 through 24, Paul indicates that he had never yet visited Rome. Now, one might try to suggest that Paul was in fact involved in the founding of the church at Rome, and that his statements in Romans 1, 10 through 13, and Romans 15, 23 through 24 do not conclusively rule this out. However, such a reading of Romans appears rather forced, and placing Paul in Rome in 42 AD creates other difficulties with the timeline of Acts. In short, trying to defend Irenaeus on this point creates more problems than it solves. So the other option is to admit that Irenaeus is wrong about Paul's involvement in the founding of the church at Rome. But even so, we are still struck by an impressive convergence between Papias and Irenaeus on the precise year of 42 AD for the date of Matthew's Gospel. However, the worry is that if Irenaeus is wrong about Paul being in Rome at this time, does this imply that more of his testimony, including his testimony about the date of Matthew's writing, is also wrong? I think that there is a good explanation for how Irenaeus could be wrong about Paul being in Rome in 42 AD, while still being right about Matthew composing his gospel while this church was being founded. The reason is that we just independently know that a lot of patristics believed that the church at Rome was founded by both Peter and Paul. No fewer than 4 other sources besides Irenaeus make this claim. As William Farmer and Roch Koretzli observe, according to the earliest available evidence, Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, Dionysius of Corinth, Irenaeus, and Tertullian, Peter and Paul together founded the church at Rome. This is significant because it helps to disentangle Irenaeus' statement about the origins of Matthew's Gospel from his claim that Paul helped found the church at Rome. In other words, the idea that Paul was in Rome in 42 AD need not be part of the information received from Irenaeus' source, who I previously argued was Polycarp, and he instead included this detail because it was a logical consequence of his belief, which was common to Christians of that time, that Paul had also helped to found the church at Rome. The upshot of this consideration is that Irenaeus' information about the date of Matthew need not be tainted by the fact that he included a mistaken claim about Paul's activities in 42 AD alongside it. Daniel Moore proposes an alternative understanding of Irenaeus' statement. He proposes that, based on how the term Rome is used within Greco-Roman literature of the day, the term need not refer exclusively to the city of Rome, but could be used more broadly to refer to the Roman Empire. He offers some examples of this in other literature before saying, with reference to Irenaeus' challenging statement, I suggest that to preach at Rome, or in Rome, was not to preach exclusively in the capital, but within the empire. Roman colonies in particular were considered extensions of Rome itself, and Caesarea Maritima would later gain that revered status under Vespasian, well before Irenaeus wrote. Therefore, insofar as these Roman bastions represented Rome, preaching even in a city like Caesarea Maritima was akin to preaching in Rome. It is also helpful to recognize that the same Greek prepositional word en stands at the head of both prepositional phrases in Irenaeus, among en the Jews, at en Rome. While among and at are both legitimate translations for en, it is unusual to select different English words for translating the same Greek word within adjacent phrases which are employing contrasting parallelism. Therefore, the modern English reader must not allow these disparate word choices to drive the understanding of the passage. Perhaps the more balanced translation might have been, Matthew also issued a written gospel amidst the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching amidst Rome. Moore's proposal is interesting, and it presents both a benefit and a problem for my argument from the convergence of Papias and Irenaeus on the date of 42 AD for the composition of Matthew's Gospel. The benefit is that it removes any possible error on Irenaeus' part with respect to his information about Paul's involvement in founding the church at Rome. The problem is that it depends on broadening Irenaeus' understanding of Rome so much that this statement here can no longer be definitively taken to refer to the founding of the church at Rome in 42 AD. If we choose to adopt Moore's proposal, then I will lose my argument from Papias' and Irenaeus' convergence on the date of 42. Nevertheless, Irenaeus would still be telling us that Matthew was written sometime in the 40s AD, which obviously harmonizes nicely with Papias' testimony, even if we don't get the admittedly far more exciting, unintentional agreement on a precise year. In the end, my judgment is that we should just accept that Irenaeus is probably mistaken about Paul's involvement in founding the church at Rome, especially since he seems to say this elsewhere. Furthermore, we know from other patristic sources that this belief about the church at Rome being founded by both Peter and Paul was widespread among early Christians. However, because of this fact, we can easily explain why Irenaeus might have mistakenly believed that Paul was involved in founding the church at Rome, without in any way impugning the reliability of his information about the date of Matthew's Gospel. Hence, we keep the convergence argument for a 42 AD date for Matthew, while admitting that Irenaeus was wrong about Paul's involvement in the founding of the Roman Church. Regardless of which conclusion one adopts with respect to Irenaeus' statement, both he and Papias are unquestionably placing Matthew in the 40s AD. Thus, my final verdict is that Matthew was written in the 40s and most likely in 42 AD. This date has been reached by a careful consideration of the evidence, both internal and external, which has forced us to push the date of composition further and further back to within about a decade of Jesus' crucifixion. This conclusion is remarkable, and it is earlier even than I had thought that I would end up dating the Gospel of Matthew when I first embarked upon this study. Nevertheless, I find myself compelled to affirm such an early date by the overwhelming preponderance of the evidence. To briefly review all of the evidence that I have brought to bear on the question of the date of Matthew's Gospel, we have seen that the Patristics allow a date no later than 64 AD. We have seen that first Clement likely dates to no later than 67 AD, and also likely knows Matthew's Gospel. I have argued that much of the material in Matthew's Gospel is very out of place if it were written after 70 AD. I have pointed out that P64, the earliest fragment from Matthew's Gospel, may date to 66 AD. All of these lines of evidence pushed Matthew into the 60s AD at the latest. I have also defended the idea that 1 Thessalonians is literarily dependent upon the 24th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, which would force Matthew into the 40s AD. And lastly, I have suggested that an undesigned coincidence between Papias and Irenaeus settles quite surprisingly on the precise date of 42 AD for the composition of Matthew.